Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Seongnam Lim, and I used to be Vice Foreign Minister from 2015 to 2018, and most recently from 2019 to 2021, I served in Jakarta as Ambassador of Korea to ASEAN. Maybe that's why I was asked to serve as moderator for this session. I'd like to begin by thanking the East Asia Foundation as well as the APLN, Asia Pacific Leadership Network, for organizing this important and timely session titled Dilemmas of Strategic Positioning in the Pacific Strategy and the Future of ASEAN. I think the title itself is self-explanatory, so I will not go into too much detail about why this topic has been chosen for this afternoon's session. As many are well aware, people used to say that the 21st century will be the period of the Asia Pacific. But instead, especially with the inauguration of the Trump administration in the United States, I believe the new geostrategic notion of the Indo-Pacific has more or less replaced the traditional notion of Asia-Pacific. And the new notion of the Indo-Pacific has been, in a sense, more systematically employed by the Biden administration, as we all witnessed through the adoption of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US, as well as the inauguration of IPEF, meaning Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where many countries or many entities in the region have responded to this new policy trend in one way or another. Among them, the reaction or the policy choice of ASEAN has constantly drawn a lot of attention from the mass media as well as the academic community. I think there are three reasons for that. Number one, ASEAN has been a very important player in the regional politics of the Asia Pacific and beyond. And number two, the South China Sea, which has been the arena for the US-China rivalry, cannot be separated from ASEAN either. And last but not least, the principles such as ASEAN centrality or the ASEAN unity, people are wondering how those principles of ASEAN can go in harmony with the variations or differences among the member states of ASEAN vis-a-vis the notion of the Indo-Pacific. So throughout the discussion this afternoon, we will be having a chance to hear the views and insights of the very distinguished panel, primarily from Southeast Asia and Korea. Let me first introduce former Permanent Secretary of the Singaporean Foreign Ministry, Mr. Bilahari. Unfortunately, he cannot join us. He will be joining the session remotely from Singapore. Why don't you give him a big hand? And to my left is former Foreign Minister of Thailand, Mr. Piromia. He served as Foreign Minister from 2008 to 2011. And before that, he was ambassador to the Soviet Union, Japan, Indonesia, and the United States. And after joining the politics, he was regarded as a champion of freedom and democracy in Thailand. Why don't you give him big hands again? To his left is Ambassador Tonnutinin. Her name is a bit difficult for me to pronounce. She is now serving as president of the Ho Chi Minh Peace and Development Foundation. And before joining that, she was very active initially as a diplomat for about 20 years serving as Vietnam's ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, and then serving as a member of the National Assembly. Why don't we give her big hands again? And last but not least, Dr. Lee Jae-hyun is a rising star in the area of the Southeast Asia or ASEAN studies in Korea. And he has got his PhD in political science from Murdoch University in Australia, and he's now affiliated with the ASEAN Policy Institute, one of the most important think tanks in Korea. Please give him big rounds of applause too. I think we will begin with the discussion about how ASEAN as a whole approached the geostrategic notion of the Indo-Pacific, as well as how each member state, in particular the mother country of the Southeast Asian participant, has approached the Indo-Pacific nationally. Of course, I will welcome any additional comments. So we will go one round, and then if I have any questions, maybe we'll go one more round, and then we'll have kind of interactive discussions among the panelists and between the panelists and the audience as well. So once again, why don't we start with Mr. Bilahari, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be invited to share my views today, and I apologize for not being able to be here in person. The reason is because tomorrow the Shangri-La Dialogue starts, and I am a member of the advisory council of the IISS, the organizers, so you understand I have to be in Singapore. Anyway, let me get straight to it. Let me start from some very first principles, from very basic principles. I think it's important for us to not lose sight of the fact that ASEAN's primary purpose is to manage relations among its members in order to ensure some measure of order in a diverse region where stability among its component states is not to be taken for granted. Dealing with external powers is a secondary function. For all ASEAN members, the primary modality for managing relations with external powers has always been national and not regional. Regional forums, say, for example, like East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, these are supplementary means to national approaches. And this is not surprising because Southeast Asia is a very diverse region. And in a diverse region, it should not be surprising that ASEAN members have different strategic assessments and outlooks. And ASEAN has never, ever tried to have a common position on every external issue. In fact, if we tried to do that, it would be kind of disastrous because it will risk differences, inevitable differences, or strategic assessments and hence interests becoming sources of intra-ASEAN tension. And this could destabilize Southeast Asia. So it follows from what I've just said, these basic principles, that ASEAN's 2019 Indo-Pacific outlook is really very largely old wine in a new bottle. In other words, it's the lowest common denominator compilation of existing projects under a new label. The 2019 document is better understood as a formal attempt to assert ASEAN's centrality. In other words, not to be left out of the debate over the Indo-Pacific, rather than a practical guide to policy by any ASEAN member state. Indo-Pacific is not a politically neutral term. And beyond the obvious geographical definition, and even geographically, the western boundary of the term is somewhat fuzzy, the term carries different shades of meaning to states that have adopted the term, or its corollaries like free and open Indo-Pacific or rules-based order. And even formal US allies like Japan, Australia, South Korea do not have exactly the same definition of these terms as each other, and certainly not India, even though it's a member of the Quad. So even if some ASEAN members and other countries use these terms, they do not necessarily mean the same thing by these terms, even if they use the same words. Singapore, for example, is a strong supporter of the rules-based order and a free and open Indo-Pacific. But we do not mean the same thing by these terms as, for example, the US or Australia or Japan. Furthermore, as these terms are politically defined, definitions, whatever your definition is not necessarily stable. And they are always situational and conditional and can be expected to evolve over time as the strategic environment and assessments of the strategic environment evolve. But what is common to all definitions of the Indo-Pacific and its corollaries is, first, concern about some aspect or another of China's behavior, and second, understanding that the US is an irreplaceable component of the regional balance that is a necessary condition for dealing with China. However, not every country has the same concerns about Chinese behavior or holds them with the same intensity. Neither does understanding that the US is an irreplaceable component of the regional balance necessarily mean that there are no concerns about one aspect or another of US behavior. So, ASEAN members of the Indo-Pacific and its corollaries like rules-based order and free and open Indo-Pacific generally falls between this very broad framework which I have sketched, with perhaps Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar as partial exceptions. Now, over time, let's say over the last 10 years, concerns about China among ASEAN members have grown, although not always articulated publicly. And in Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, these concerns exist primarily on the ground, at the people level, rather than the governmental level. Concurrently, there is today a better appreciation of the US role in maintaining balance among most ASEAN members, again with Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia as partial exceptions. Thailand, under the current militarily dominated government, is ambivalent about the US. It remains to be seen what the attitude of a new Thai government that will be formed sooner or later after the elections will be. Now, of course, the translation of these very broad common understandings into interest and hence implementation as policies remains a matter of the national policies of individual members. So let me summarize. I don't want to take too much time. In summary, all countries, including former US allies, face two fundamental realities. First, we must deal with both the US and China, and dealing with both simultaneously is a necessary condition of dealing with either effectively. And second, there is no country without some degree of concern about some aspect or another of both US and Chinese behavior. Now, you put these two fundamental realities together, and I think what you will find is that all countries will seek to maximize strategic flexibility within the constraints of their particular circumstances. And the Indo-Pacific, the idea of the Indo-Pacific will have many manifestations. These manifestations will change over time and may even be different according to different issues. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. And once again, apologies for not being able to be there in person.
Thank you, Mr. Billahari, for the very succinct presentation about the thinking on ASEAN, as well as the relationship between ASEAN on the one hand and the US and China on the other hand. Maybe we'll have more questions about all those points later on. And now I believe the floor is for former Foreign Minister Peter Mia. This is the microphone for you.
Thank you very much. My names always begin with former this and that and so on, which is very true. I am at the moment a full-time Thai citizen as well as a citizen of the ASEAN community. I am not at all involved with any official functions of the Thai government or the ASEAN Secretariat. So I'm more or less a free man and a freelance. And thank you, first of all, to the organizers and also to Birahari, a good friend whom I highly respect
haven't seen
and
each
see
other
him
for a
very
long
often
time.
on YouTube and all of this and so on. I keep on learning from him and then always behave as a good student when he gives the lectures. Thank you very much.
Oh dear.
I would like to approach the whole ASEAN position from the, I think, perspective or from the framework of about, I think, 4 legal documents of ASEAN. First is the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Second, I think the ASEAN Declaration on the nuclear, Southeast Asia as a nuclear-free zone. Third is the ASEAN also Declaration on the Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. May I put the emphasis on the word neutrality. And the fourth document is the ASEAN Charter and its subsequent positioning of ASEAN, that it is people-based. And second, it would like to be the major architecture of what's going on in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. It would like to play the centrality role in the regional happenings. And having cited these 4 very basic documents, then I would then relate it to the positioning of ASEAN with the conclusion that in the Indo-Pacific region or the Asia-Pacific region, with the big power rivalry, especially between the United States and China, ASEAN from now on, and if I were to be able to be part of the decision-making of the ASEAN bodies, I would suggest that we go for the non-allied and neutrality route in this big power rivalry, because the Treaty of Amity says so, and the 2 declarations as well as the ASEAN Charter. And I could expound by the fact that the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which a lot of friends and everyone has been acceding to, signing and ratifying and so on. But under that scope, I could even venture to say that that's why we do have dialogue partnerships with all the major players of the world and in the region, whether China, Russia, the United States, Japan, and so on. So we are friends with everyone and we do trade with everyone. And the word amity is that we are not an enemy or we would like to confront anyone. And why should we take side when we are friends with everyone? So that is in support of this neutrality positioning of ASEAN. Second is that the nuclear-free zone and the zone of, I think, freedom and neutrality and so on also indicates that ASEAN cannot side either with China or the United States because they are nuclear powers. At the same time, ASEAN should not be in the position like, I think, Japan or even South Korea to have the US nuclear umbrella to cover its security. ASEAN does not need that. I don't think that China would dare to attack ASEAN in that sense, and we do not have to recourse to the nuclear deterrence to be supplied by the United States and so on. And I think zone of freedom and neutrality, why not? When we are friends with everyone and we are not enemy of anyone, we do trade with everyone. So we have to maintain that neutrality role, but not just to be passive. I think with that positioning of ASEAN, then ASEAN could venture to do positive things. For example, it could be in the position to propose to the world at large and to North Korea and South Korea in particular that the two must get together at a negotiating table to make or to turn the Korean Peninsula into a new non-nuclear free and non-allied and neutrality. At the same time, ASEAN in its neutral position could speak both to Beijing and to Taipei that kindly finish the unfinished or incomplete Civil War since 1949 through the negotiation. Either you want to join as a sort of a federation or you want to go a separate way, but you do not have the responsibility and the moral right to kill each other, and not only to a sort of a self-destruction, but it would bring a lot of harms and destruction to the Asia Pacific and to the international community at large. So both Beijing and Taipei have the moral obligation to themselves and to the world at large. And that's where I think the role of ASEAN as a neutral entity could play a lot of things positively. And then when it comes to Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, ASEAN as a neutral entity can join forces to bring about, I think, peace and development of the whole of South China Sea. It could come out in the open to speak in a sort of a black and white manner that China has no right to undertake unilateral actions or activities in the South China Sea. And whatever is happening in South China Sea, ASEAN, the Southeast Asia as a zone of neutrality should be informed. Any military exercises by anyone should have the courtesy to inform ASEAN, and the ASEAN as a whole have every right to ask everyone to behave accordingly to make Southeast Asia, the South China Sea as a zone of non-nuclear and a zone of freedom and neutrality and so on. Could I just end at this point in time? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Piromia. I think he has kindly introduced all the important documents. This side. Okay. He has introduced many important documents in ASEAN, such as Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and ZOFAN and so on and so forth. And he also talked about very specific issues, such as the need to resume the dialogue between the two Koreas and the need for the peaceful settlement between China and Taiwan. Maybe later I'll ask Minister Piromia more specific questions about those issues. Okay, now we go to Ambassador Nin, please.
Thank you. Hello, dear friend Bilahari Korsikan from...
Hi. I haven't seen you for years.
Good to see you from a distance and to hear you. Just the same as usual. Actually, listening to you, I'm going to skip some of my remarks and more or less address some of the things you said. You seem to sort of adopt deliberately, low-key, a bit self-deprecating, description, take on ASEAN. So, indeed, we don't have a common position on, international issues and so on and so forth. We don't have the problems that EU has. Actually, it's a plus for us because we have this policy of accommodating national positions with, ASEAN positions on other things than things international. So I would like now to mention why, against the background of the US-China rivalry or competition these days and the emergence of the framework of the broader framework of Indo-Pacific, why we can still say that there is some agency for ASEAN. Minister Evans here was questioning, can ASEAN make a difference? What I'm saying is this. We need to remember the ASEAN, security, ASEF, the ASEAN Security Forum, managed 1 year, I remember, to have DPRK invited and present. President of the United States met with Kim Jong-un where? In ASEAN, 2 ASEAN countries, Singapore and Vietnam. So then, when Vietnam was chairman of ASEAN in 2010, we had the initiative of expanding ADMM, that is to say 10 members, to the plus formula with the 8 dialogue partners. And remember, the dialogue partners include everybody that is in the conversation about the Indo-Pacific today. To remember, Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. What about that? So that leads me to say, ASEAN has the kind of convenient agency that we are not perceived as a threat to anybody. And we are perceived, on the contrary, I wouldn't say completely neutral, but as a convenient and positive-minded facilitator and convener. So if you don't know where to meet, ASEAN might be the place for you, especially against this fraught regional context. So I want to emphasize that, because sometimes one tends to dismiss the possible role and agency of ASEAN precisely because it doesn't take a common international positions on difficult issues. But I think it is, if you take the long view from when it was created in 1967, then through the travails of the Cambodia episode and period, to, for example, when Vietnam joined. And since Vietnam joined, I think we have been a good student and become, in fact, a positive, active contributor to some kind of agency. Witness the initiative by Vietnam in 2010 to open up the ADMM format to add the 8 dialogue partners, and they all came, you see. So this is the first point I'd like to add. The second point is the insurance, the guarantee for ASEAN longevity, endurance, or resilience in, tumultuous times is precisely what people sometimes say is its weakness. The fact that, the principle of consensus, of accommodation, of national positions. Well, to me, it's a good thing. So within ASEAN, we have, clear security allies of the US, with clear partnerships. And together with that, Vietnam's 4-no national defense policies. But we are still good bedfellows because the framework, the regional framework, is one where we all feel comfortable because we do not let the national positions hamper our ability to go along and find some amount of realistic consensus. And ASEAN has good relations with all the members of the broader format of the Indo-Pacific. So when we speak about centrality, my point will be to say that, finally to say that the principle of ASEAN centrality is not to say that we are very important, that we are high up there, but it means that, as philosopher Voltaire in France said, if God did not exist, one would have to invent God. I think at this precise moment in time, ASEAN, it's good that ASEAN is here. And I'm really pleased that the Jeju Forum and the East Asia Foundation and APLN chose this topic and to invite members from ASEAN to come and share together with our friends from the Republic of Korea. So some food for thought for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nin. I think Ambassador Nin was making a point very contrasting to the position presented by Mr. Bilahari. I think Ambassador Nin was more optimistic about the role and future of ASEAN, referring to such institution as ADMM+, which is the abbreviation of the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, which began in 2010. And to me, the two different views of Ambassador Nin and Mr. Bilahari sounds like someone is saying the glass is half empty, and another person is saying the glass is half full. I might be wrong, and maybe Dr. Lee Jae-hyun could make a final verdict. Please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I have to repeat the thanking of my co-panelists to the APLN and the East Asia Foundation. And on one hand, I have to say thank you, but on the other hand, East Asia Foundation put me in a very difficult situation. As you can see, my co-panelists, they were the people who were at the center of ASEAN history and all the actions and policy implementation. But I'm just a scholar who are looking at Southeast Asia. But anyway, I got 2 points to make in this introductory remark. The first one is about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. This session is particularly focusing on the ASEAN's position in the Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific region. So the first one is on today's ASEAN's position and strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. And the second point that I would like to make is I would like to be more positive than Ambassador Nin, as Ambassador Im Sung-nam said. And these days, there are a lot of talks and debates about ASEAN disunity, ASEAN division, and I would like to make a point that you have to think twice. The first one on the ASEAN, the outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN leaders in 2019, they first announced ASEAN's own vision for the Indo-Pacific region. And later in Cambodia, the leaders got together again and they made a declaration to mainstream the AUIP in all ASEAN cooperation among ASEAN member states, and also at the same time between ASEAN member states and external parties. Basically, AUIP has got 4 different areas of cooperation. The first, connectivity, maritime issues, and as sustainable development goal, as well as development of whole Southeast Asian countries. The basic direction of this AUIP is how to channel external assistance or external help for the benefit of ASEAN member countries. And I believe that's the very wise way to go for Southeast Asian countries. As superpowers competition get harder and harder, then Southeast Asian countries have got some leverage against these big powers. And they can utilize this sort of leverage for the benefit of ASEAN member state. Up to here, it's okay, it's fine. ASEAN has got very good strategy toward the Indo-Pacific region, as well as toward the bigger powers, dialogue partners. But I hope ASEAN go a step further from there. Because today we don't have an Indonesian representative in this session, but I'd like to get the I'd like to quote Indonesian foreign policy tradition, as well as I believe it's a part of it's also the part of ASEAN foreign policy tradition, what we call aktif dan bebas, proactive and independent. I mean, today, between United States and China, Southeast Asian countries together in the form of ASEAN are very independent. They don't want to be a part on either US or China. That's fine. But what is missing is proactive aspect of Southeast Asia. As you can see, the US-China strategic competition has been in place more than a decade. At least it started late 2000, and it's been like 10 years or 15 years. If we in a couple of years' time, it will be almost 2 decades. And today, there is a rising protectionism in this part of the world. In the context of a US-China strategic competition, exactly the session before this session's topic was how the regional countries respond to rising protectionist trend in the region. All this strategic competition between United States and China and the economic competition, economic security issues, supply chain issues, all this put such a great strategic uncertainty and strategic pressure on regional small and medium countries, including South Korea and Southeast Asian states. I believe, given the history of Southeast Asia, of Southeast Asian history of building multilateral cooperation, I believe ASEAN has got the potential to lead regional small and medium countries to expand its autonomous strategic space in between the US and China. There are a lot of cries in the region that we have to avoid the clash between the US and China, and these guys, these big powers are racing to the bottom, and we are under strategic pressure. As someone has to come out and lead regional small and medium countries. And I believe ASEAN has to do that. And AYP has to have that kind of strategy in it. And the second point I would like to make is on ASEAN unity or disunity. And if I'm not wrong, the people started to talk about ASEAN disunity since 2012. What we call Phnom Penh fiasco. There was ASEAN ministerial meeting, and for the first time in 45 AMMs, it was the first time that the foreign minister could not issue chairman's statement. And since then, there was a South China Sea issue and blah, blah, blah. And today, people talk about ASEAN division, disunity, and because of this unity within ASEAN, ASEAN centrality is in danger. That's widespread perception. I would like to argue this. ASEAN is not an institution. It's an association of many members with diverse interests and voice and identities. They have different national interests, they have different identities, different culture, different language, religion. And as you can remember, the ASEAN for the first time established its organization in 1967. That's almost 70 years ago. And there has been so many events that could bring the whole ASEAN down in the past 70 years. But anyway, ASEAN was able to manage all the challenges, accommodate different interests and ideas and voices among themselves. And this is what Ambassador Nin said, resilience. ASEAN has survived the 70 years of very turbulent times, and it's got potential. And I believe, if an institution or regional organization is based on strong legal basis, then it can break down. If a member, if a big country as a member defects, then the institution would break down. But ASEAN is not like that. It's still very flexible and very resilient, and it's not complete. The whole process of ASEAN history is making this sort of debate and accommodation. So I believe that ASEAN is very resilient and still it's got a lot of potential to manage the challenges and things ahead of Southeast Asian countries. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for the final verdict about the future of ASEAN, which is the more optimistic from the panel, I believe. I think the two major questions I can gather from the initial presentations is number one, I'd like to ask each panelist one more round. So the first question I'd like to ask each panelist is, regardless of your view about the usefulness or uselessness of ASEAN in dealing with the current turbulences, if ASEAN is truly interested in making one more step ahead, if ASEAN is interested in becoming a more meaningful institution dealing with the regional instability, especially created by the rivalry between Beijing and Washington, then what will be your actual kind of policy recommendation? For instance, I agree with Mr. Bilahari that ASEAN is focused on the consensus among ASEAN member states about the internal issues, about the relations among themselves, not necessarily with external powers. But having said that, having heard that, my question would be, but still if ASEAN is interested in making an indelible imprint in dealing with all those regional insecurities, then what will you do? What will be your recommendation to the leaders of ASEAN? So that's my first question, which I will go around in asking each panelist. And my second question is, Mr. Bilahari was saying that we have to deal both with China and the US. And both China and the US have some problems. He didn't go into details. But I believe everybody is more or less on the same page in that respect. Then I'd like to ask each panelist once again, what will be your policy advice, say to Washington and Beijing? Or what will be your policy advice to your own leadership so that your own leaders can tell Washington and Beijing to do this and that in softening the rivalry between those two superpowers or in relieving the regional tensions we have seen so far? So basically, I'd like to ask each panelist to be more proactive in terms of presenting their ideas for this session. So, well, in the same order, I'd like to ask Mr. Bilahari first, and then we'll ask Minister, and then Ambassador Nin, and then Dr. Lee. Maybe maximum 3 to 5 minutes. Mr. Bilahari, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I don't think my dear friend Madam Nin and I, or my dear friend from Thailand, are saying fundamentally different things. We don't want to take sides. We want to be neutral, but that doesn't mean we are going to be passive. In fact, in order to be neutral, not to take sides, you cannot be passive. It requires an active foreign policy to pursue your own interests and not let other countries impose interests on you. from that perspective, let me try to answer your first question, your two questions. Firstly, look, I think ASEAN is very useful. The fundamental way we deal with major powers is to stabilize the region among ourselves. If conflict breaks out among ASEAN members, there will be greater and greater opportunity for major powers to determine the future of the region rather than the region determining its future for itself. My first policy recommendation, actually also my second policy recommendation, is that we need to recapture a sense of strategic realism. I think ASEAN is in some danger of losing the strategic realism that enabled us to navigate the dangers of the US, the earlier period of US-Soviet Union competition, which in many ways was far more dangerous than the current US-China competition. Because do not forget, US-Soviet competition in Southeast Asia was not a Cold War, it was a hot war, especially in the mainland of Southeast Asia. But ASEAN was able to manage it. It's a different ASEAN. It was a smaller ASEAN, a more compact ASEAN, was able to navigate those dangers because we had a very clear sense of what we could do and what we could not do. I think we are in some danger of losing that sense. And I give you two examples. First of all, Myanmar. ASEAN's position on Myanmar is one that, is a very noble position, but it is a dead end. You have neither carrots nor sticks to influence the military regime in Myanmar. So if you have neither carrots nor sticks, how can you exercise some influence? You can only exercise some influence by talking to them. But you have now refused to let them attend ASEAN meetings. How is that a good thing? In other words, you have conceded the initiative over what happens to Myanmar entirely to the military regime. You have no say. My second example is the decision, fortunately only in principle, to admit Timor-Leste as the 11th member at some undetermined point. Look, let's be very frank. Timor-Leste is not a viable state. It is a very poor country. The oil revenue will run out in about a decade. It is highly tribalized with many languages, and the leadership has been the same leadership for about 25, almost 30 years. Guterres, Ramos Horta, Zanana, they're all in their late 70s, and there's no new generation of leaders in sight. Why do we want this to be a member of ASEAN? How does that help us? I don't know. This is total lack of strategic realism. And these are two relatively clear-cut issues. If you are going to navigate US-China relations, we have to be a little bit more focused in what we can do and what we cannot do. We have to recover that. Now, what advice will I give to my government? My advice from that perspective, the perspective of strategic realism, is there's nothing you can do. Look to your own interests and try to survive their competition. Try to benefit from it if you can. They are not going to listen to you. Neither the US nor China is going to listen to you. Look, Madam Lin talked about the US and North Korea choosing to meet in Vietnam and Singapore. That's very good. But what did they achieve? Nothing. The PRC, China and Taiwan have met in Singapore a couple of times. What did they achieve? Nothing. ASEAN does have convening power, and that's not unuseful. But convening power is useful only if those that you convene want to use it in a positive way. I don't see any prospect of the US or China at this particular moment wanting to be able to listen to ASEAN or be prepared to listen to ASEAN. Now, if we try to interfere in this, it will only diminish our reputation because we will achieve nothing and they will think we are idiots because we do not know the limits of our own power. Right now, I think what my advice to my government, if I was still in government, would be, yes, this is a new period of great power competition. They are not in a position to listen to us. Of course, we have to make our views known, but in a realistic way so that without any expectation, they will adopt our views. We have to look to our own interests, our own national interests, our own regional interests, and try to navigate through this period without being too ambitious, without That does not mean that we are passive. It means actually quite an active foreign policy to navigate all these new tensions and dangers. That's my advice.
Thank you, Mr. Bilahari, for enlightening us with the notion of strategic realism. And now, may I ask Minister Piromia.
Thank you. I think the three of us, Bilahari, Madam Tin, and myself, we somewhat grew up in the ASEAN circle as bureaucrats. And what we have seen since we were young officers or diplomats until we reached the age of retirement, I think was the closeness, the friendship and affinity among all the bureaucrats or diplomats that we do meet within the ASEAN circle at the director general level or at the senior official level of ASEAN. So that was at the, I think, bureaucratic level. And on top of that, at the political level, looking for as a young diplomat towards Ali Alatas or Thanat Korman or Dana Baland or Rajaratnam and all of these of the foreign ministers and so on, we look up at them in admiration and in awe, and we learned a lot from them. And one thing that came out very clearly is the friendship, esprit de corps of working together of ASEAN first, of the 5 and of the 6, and finally ASEAN of the 10. And being very friendly, then we were able to solve a lot of problems or to unify the position and so on, to have a collective position over a cup of coffee, over a glass of wine, or even a game of golf. I think that has been the tradition all along, that getting to know one another and trying to speak to one another in a very frank manner. And of course, the intelligence of the Singaporean delegation has always been there behind the scene, coming out with excellent ideas and so on. And then we could move forward. But what I have been noticing for the past 10 years is that lack of affinity, both at the bureaucrat levels and also at the political level. The foreign ministers for the past 10 years seems to be quite a foreigner to one another. So without that friendship and the closeness and the sense of purpose, then we could not have a meaningful position. And a case in point that has been demonstrated clearly of that weaknesses is the 5-point consensus of ASEAN, or even the inability to come to terms with the, I think, joint position on the South China Sea. Whether some of us are, in dispute with China, and then some of us are not, and so on. But as ASEAN, we must have a joint position, and we cannot allow any breakaway and all of this and so on. So first, we must have a meaningful relationship within the ASEAN side, and then once we have that, then we can tell the world what we want, how we're going to play the role at the United Nations, whether in Geneva or in New York, at the World Trade Organization, or even to a limited extent in the APEC circle and so on, or in G20, although not every one of us are members and so on, but we could ask whoever is inside those bodies or the chair and so on to speak and reflect the position of ASEAN. That is much needed. And second, I would like to repeat again that I started with the premise that because there is the rivalry between China and the United States, and my proposal to the meeting and to my government and so on is that we must not take side. We must remain neutral. And as Birihari has said, but we will be a very proactive, neutral entity. We are aware of the limitations. We are not a military power and so on. But we have the power of the voice and of the pen and of the intellectual capacity that we can convey to the world at large. And hopefully, it will press the Chinese or the Americans to behave accordingly and not to use their rivalry to destroy our prosperity and our future and so on. So that is what it is. Then the other point is that we, ASEAN of the 10, must sit together and I think make a list of priorities or activities. Maybe 15 things that we will do with China, and maybe 10 things we will not do with China. Then another 15 things we will do with the United States, and a few things we will not do with the United States. And we will tell both the Chinese and to the Americans what we are doing with each one of them in our own interest, and with the awareness of our own limitation, but with the appreciation that we must earn from them, that they have to respect us. This is what we can do as much as we can to reflect our interests, but not that we are not their underlings and they are not in the position to bully us and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Piromia. I think his point is basically ASEAN should not take sides, but at the same time should be proactive. And more specifically, I think he has kind of made a proposal for making a list of 50 things ASEAN will do, with either China or the US, and the list of 10 things ASEAN will not do, either with the US or China. I think that was one of the specific ideas which has come from the panel so far, I believe. Okay, Ambassador Nin?
Thank you. Well, I do agree with Mr. Bilahari Kausikan about strategic realism being perhaps the best common approach to take for ASEAN members in the current context. I'd like on this to propose that the kind of neutrality that he was referring to as being not the same as passive, but being proactive. What I'd like to remind you of is during the war, the Vietnam War, and there was the China-Soviet Union, difficulties, in their partnership. Vietnam knew how to manage to navigate that difficulty, having relations with both, and managing to get the support, military, economic, and financial, that it needed. So what I'd like to stress is we are neutral for our own sake, the sake of each member of ASEAN, for the sake of ASEAN as an organization. But what does it mean for the broader region as a whole? What are they expecting from us at all? Are they expecting anything? From the kind of description that our friend Bilahari was making, it would seem that they are not expecting anything from us. Or can they? Can they? In other words, if we declare that we are neutral, then what can they expect from us? Aside from trying to pull us one side or the other on certain specific issues. And each of us as a country, we navigate it our own way, and ASEAN doesn't have to say, it doesn't say anything on that. To be very straightforward, the very close relations between Cambodia and Laos with China, to be blunt, Vietnam is keeping a very close eye on. You see what I mean? But what is Vietnam to say to Laos and Cambodia? You see? So I think that ASEAN, therefore, has definitely a role to play. It's a space where the common voices of caution about overleaning on any source of support, be it economic or military or whatnot, it's useful. There's a place where, messages and some wisdom, practical, real wisdom from history can be shared in private conversations. So that's why I was saying, if ASEAN didn't exist, we would have to create an ASEAN. The Southeast Asian region is where it is today economically because of ASEAN. Remember, 25% of ASEAN's total trade is intra-regional, while in South Asia, it's only 5%. So this 25% figure speaks to the intra-regional synergy. In other words, I wanted to add one element of confidence in the raison d'etre of ASEAN and in the kind of impetus that it provides regionally alongside each national impetus to move forward. So the question that remains is, we haven't asked ourselves the question, is the rest of the region looking to ASEAN for a role, for a specific position, explicit position at this specific point in time when, there is this sort of this uncertain strategic environment? This is a question I think perhaps Mr. Bilahari Korsikan could answer. But here, for example, I would like to remind ourselves that RCEP, 10 ASEAN members are members of RCEP. In CPTPP, Singapore, Vietnam, Brunei, and perhaps one more. Well, I mean, not all of us.
Malaysia.
Malaysia, yes, thank you. Yes, 4 of us. So, you can see that this flexibility in deciding your own engagement with the world and the region really rests with each member country. But here, I think if I had something to suggest to my government, or even to members of ASEAN, would be regarding IPEF. Now, my comment would be this. We hedge between China and the US. But again, I think when you already have CPTPP, and at the previous session, it was mentioned that the former US administration, had lost a big opportunity by withdrawing from CPTPP. RCEP has China and the 10 ASEAN member countries, and perhaps that's why, this IPEF comes for the US to regain agency. Now, we will have to all join IPEF to send the signal that it's neither China nor the US only for us, right? I mean, along that logic, should we all join, nationally, IPEF? But, this multiplication of, trade, structures and mechanisms, it's because of the agency of the US having missed the previous opportunity. Should we follow? So our neutrality in this, should it be because we're members of RCEP, we should also all join IPEF? I don't believe so. So if I would be talking to my government, although I'm no economist, but I don't think we should pay the price of looking neutral, for looking neutral by automatically all of us joining IPEF without consideration of what kind of specific benefits and how important it is for us. I mean, it's our administration is so much under pressure of the multiplicity of frameworks that one more, I don't think, may necessarily serve our purpose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Nin. Among all those points she just made, the most striking one for me was that ASEAN should not allow being silent or being neutral to be taken for granted by Chinese or by the Americans. Lastly, I'd like to ask Dr. Lee, but if you could be as short as possible, that would be very much appreciated.
Okay. Actually, I got a lot of things to talk about, but I would like to be short. Let me build my answer on the points I made in the first round, ASEAN's potential. As Mr. Billari said, ASEAN's got convening power, definitely. And ASEAN can say that, hey, you guys, US and China, come here, and you can discuss your matters and find a solution. The same goes for North Korea and South Korea. Hey, North Korea and South Korea, you are a member of ARF, come to ASEAN, you can discuss your own matters and you can find a solution in the context of ARF or multilateral cooperation with ASEAN. That's fine. But I push ASEAN countries go a step further from just the convening power. And Mr. Billari just mentioned strategic realism. And I would rather be a constructivist here. And my point is ASEAN's got potential not just getting these big powers together, but getting these powers together, and also ASEAN got the power to lead the remaining countries, South Korea, Australia, Japan, India. If Japan says something, other countries would not listen. If Australia says something, other countries may not listen. India, probably the same. But if ASEAN raise a flag, other countries would follow. That's the power that ASEAN has. Then get these small and medium powers in the region and to reflect small and medium powers' voice and interest in the context of US-China strategic competition. The ASEAN countries should not discount its own experience. In just before 1967, when ASEAN formed, ASEAN 5 countries formed association, there was problem among themselves. The foreign military base issue, the military alliance with United States, they solved it. In the 1980s, the ASEAN came out with economic schemes. There was economic competition among Southeast Asian countries. It failed. But in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War context, they made it. And when the US withdrew from Southeast Asia and Soviet collapsed, and China was not that big in the early 1990s, there was a power vacuum in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries got together and filled that power vacuum by proposing ARF. And later, on the ashes of 1997 and 98 economic crisis, it was ASEAN's initiative to get +3 countries, China, Korea, Japan, and formed what we call ASEAN +3 today. And I believe ASEAN got this potential to lead regional small and medium countries and get this US and China, hey, you guys slow down. That's not the right way to go, the big countries. That's my first point. And briefly, just a recommendation, because I'm South Korean, recommendation to Korean government. When ASEAN countries and ASEAN raise flag, South Korea has to support it, fully support it. Of course, here, my own share of strategic realism. In the eyes of South Korea, for South Korea's national interest, of course, US and China, the big powers, are number one concern. In Southeast Asian countries, Japan, Australia, India, I'm sorry to say this, but these countries are secondary concern. The same goes for Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN. For ASEAN, these big powers in US, China are the biggest concern. Cooperation with South Korea is something, in the second tier. That's reality, that's fact. But nevertheless, South Korea to navigate between the US and China, this strategic competition, we need to have our own separate strategic network, which I believe we can find in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asian countries too, if they want to navigate between the US and China, they have their own independent and separate strategic network. They can find that strategic network in a cooperation with South Korea. That's my recommendation for Korean government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee, for your recommendation about the need for strengthening network between ASEAN on the one hand and the Republic of Korea on the other hand. I think we have less than 10 minutes, so let me open the floor to the audience. So if there are any questions, okay, let me begin from the first row and then I will go to you. The gentleman here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Dominic Phillips from East Asia Foundation. My question was, ASEAN as an organization is founded on neutrality, but you could say that some member states are far from neutral, and Ambassador Nin did mention like Cambodia and Laos. So my question is certain individual member states closer alignments with either the US or China, is that a threat to ASEAN's neutrality, or is there a way that ASEAN can address that?
Okay, maybe I will gather maybe one more question from the floor and then you'll have the chance to answer. Mr. Evans? Oh, yeah, and then Mr. Evans.
I'm Huang Vu from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Distinguished panelists, gurus of ASEAN, the 2019 AOIP was set up as an attempt for ASEAN to respond to the various versions of Indo-Pacific strategies. So I seek your advice on how ASEAN should respond to the current set of initiatives by China, including the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. How should ASEAN respond? Thank you.
Okay, and then.
Thank you. John Blaxland from the Australian National University in Australia. Pleasure to see you again, Bilahari and Kungasit. Nice to see you again. I'm a bit uncomfortable about how little we talk about Myanmar. The corrosive effect on ASEAN of the lack of action on Myanmar. I'm sitting next to Gareth Evans, former Australian Foreign Minister, who was instrumental in collaboration with ASEAN, Indonesia, Japan and others in coming up with the Cambodian Peace Accord. What is it about the failure of imagination of ASEAN today that this problem festers to the extent it has? Is there anything we can do, and will it further undermine the centrality of ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got altogether 3 questions from the audience. And I will assign the question from Vietnam regarding how to address China's global initiatives such as Global Security Initiative, Development Initiative, and Civilization Initiative. I think Mr. Bilahari will answer that question. And then with regard to the question from Australia regarding the lack of discussion on Myanmar, I'll ask Minister to answer the question. And then the last question, the first question from EAI Fellow will be answered by Ambassador Nin. Maybe 1 minute for each. Mr. Bilahari?
Well, first of all, I do not know what the Global Security Initiative is. It is rather vague. Secondly, I think the Global Civilizational Initiative is a load of rubbish. All countries develop along their own path. That is what China is saying. But that's like saying water is wet. China developed on its own path. So did Japan. So did Singapore. So did Australia. So did Vietnam, and so on. Modernization is necessarily Westernization, because modernity is the organization of modern industrial society. All the models are Western. There are only 2 basic models, and both are Western. One is the European American model, which is based on the individual and the market primarily. And there is the Russian Soviet model, which is based on a planned economy and the dominance of the vanguard party as the representative of the people. These are the only 2 choices of any country had, right? But every country modified these things. How China implemented the Soviet model was not the same as how Vietnam did, how Laos did, how Bulgaria did during the earlier period. The Global Development Initiative is has the most definition. And insofar as it is in conformity or supplementary and supportive of the development goals that have been set out by the UN and its related agencies, I think ASEAN should support it. Again, this is a case of, we have to determine what our own interests are nationally and regionally and follow them. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bilahari. Minister Piromia.
Oh, sorry, can I just say one thing? Myanmar, we are at a dead end because the basic problem is ASEAN got on a high moral horse and has no way of going down. So if you're sitting on a high horse, you may look noble, but you are rather ineffectual.
Okay, Mr. Minister.
Hello.
About Myanmar.
ASEAN is composed of 10 members. Brunei is an absolute monarchy. Laos and Vietnam is a one-party system. And then we have autocracy in Cambodia and a bit of multi-party system returning to the Philippines, consensus democracy in Indonesia, a one-party dominance in Singapore, and a bit excellent good governance and so on, And then Malaysia is an impasse of the more progressive and less progressive coalition government. Thailand is juxtaposition between the military influence and dominated politics and a more progressive. So all in all, the 9 countries of ASEAN are not in the position collectively to handle the Myanmar democracy and human rights crisis. It's not our job from the beginning. We can't. We don't have the competency, neither the consensus to do so. And it was wrong for the UN Security Council and the UN Security Secretary General and international community to say that this is an ASEAN affair. It is a democracy affair. ASEAN is not competent. I think the onus or the responsibility must go back to the UNSC and UNSG. That would be my answer why all of this. Unless and until that tomorrow we have all the 10 members of ASEAN becoming democracy, then we can handle the Myanmar situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Minister and Ambassador Nin.
Yes, so 1 minute on, the fact that ASEAN members and Vietnam in particular, of course, are following closely, the closeness of each country within ASEAN, but particularly those that have a common land border with China, specifically Laos and Cambodia. But having noted that, there are many, many ways to deal with it outside ASEAN, bilaterally. So just follow the incredible number of bilateral visits between Vietnam and those two countries that will tell you that we don't intend to loosen our embrace of these two old traditional neighbors. But that is precisely why also we need the broader ASEAN forum, so that we can discuss internally and hear other different voices that may help our neighbors, strike the right, let's say, middle path. Thank you.
Please.
One other point to add. I think 8 ASEAN member states play by the collective gain, and every member of ASEAN has the responsibility not only to itself, but to the ASEAN as a whole. I think this is very important. And only 2 member states do not play this collective game. I think Cambodia under Somdet Hun Sen, it's always a unilateral position disregarding the collective position of ASEAN. And of course now we have Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, or even under Aung San Suu Kyi also. She was never here and there inside the ASEAN. Vietnam has been an excellent, I'm not saying this because I'm in front of Madame Win, but I have been dealing with Vietnam for quite a long time. And we were one time enemies, but I think we have been the best of friends, and our cooperation bilaterally and inside the ASEAN context, I think have all been very excellent indeed. I have said this many times profoundly and sincerely to many of the Vietnamese counterparts at the party and in the administration. I think everyone has to have the spirit of Vietnam in order to help each other, ASEAN as a whole to move forward. Thank you.
Okay, one final sentence from Dr. Lee. Final sentence.
Just 10 seconds. I talked a lot about the small and medium powers in the region. And if you look at the situation after World War II, the Southeast Asian countries and Korea had no choice but to accept the regional order imposed by superpower or superpowers. But now the power balance is different. Small and medium powers are much more powerful than we were right after the World War II. We have to remember that point. Thank you.
Okay, I think in conclusion, I'd like to say that I have learned a lot about the need for strategic realism on the one hand, and the need for balanced or proactive balancing or proactive neutrality on the other hand. I hope ASEAN could overcome all those obstacles and difficulties which are facing ASEAN right now, and then can develop into a more meaningful and influential body in the coming years. Why don't you give a big hand to the panel? Thank you.